So welcome to an unfortunately foggy day on the grassy plains, and today we will be continuing with the faction showcases, and we will be moving on to the last of the evil men factions in UMBAR, and we are actually coming to the end of the faction showcases overall. I think I've only got 3 more after this, so then we'll be moving back onto the top 10s, but a little word on UMBAR before we start. They have of course filled out the entire roster, and it is worth saying as well that there is an armour upgrade available for the Corsair Pikemen and the Corsair Savages, but I made the executive decision to leave them out because the upgraded armour variant of the standard Corsairs is going to be quite indicative of what they are as well. Excuse me. Anyway, as you can see by the fact that they have filled out this roster, UMBAR have got a pretty big roster in general, to be honest with you. But Infantry is certainly a big focus of theirs, and in terms of factions you can readily compare them to Gondor, of course, because not only do they borrow quite a lot mechanically from Gondor, but also stylistically, as we will see with one unit in particular, their Gondorian heritage is not forgotten, shall we say. We shall start off, and actually starting off, one of the things that does set UMBAR apart from Gondor quite a bit is actually their lower tier units. Gondor don't have too many options for units that are cheap and quite numerous, but UMBAR, being an evil men faction, do. They borrow this a little bit from the Orc philosophy, of course, and the Corsairs are one of the cheaper militia units that you can buy as a result of this. There are quite a lot of them per unit, 204. This far outstrips some of the other good kingdoms of men with their lower tier units. So, for example, the Dol Amroth standard swordsmen have got a substantial amount of men less. But the Corsairs do have lower stats overall, but mainly this comes down to their lower defensive stats, and this is obviously because they have less armour, but in particular their complete lack of a shield. Now, they are very cheap, and they do make a pretty good tar pit as a result of there being just so many of them, and they're also so cheap that archers won't really want to waste their ammunition on them. And over here you can see the upgraded armour variant, which does look a good amount better, and obviously this does make them a little bit tougher, a little bit more, I suppose, a bit more of a melee tar pit than anything else, because their lack of a shield and their overall low armour values are still going to count against them a lot when they are trying to deal with ranged fire. But even so, they're so cheap that if you have a little bit of money spare to buy a unit of Corsairs that you can just throw into battle wherever, they can often be quite good. And obviously if you've got low funds in a sort of siege battle where the attackers, you're on the attacking team, and the money is having to be distributed between quite a lot of factions, you might want to get quite a few Corsairs just so you can try and go for the attrition approach to warfare, which of course some of the Orc factions are capable of doing. Stylistically, of course, basically the same look to the units are going to be the Corsair Pikemen, but this is where we start to get into some of the non-fodder units of UMBAR. Now, Corsair Pikemen are they are one of 2 pikes that UMBAR have available to them, and one of 3 polearm units. Now, obviously you can see that they have relatively low stats, but again, they bear quite a lot in common. I've been using them as an example all throughout these showcases as an example of a cheap pike that is capable of sort of holding back a lot more value than you put into a single unit of pike, so they can hold up very expensive units for a long time. They wield actually long harpoons, which is a pretty neat detail. Obviously their stats are very low. Obviously archers are going to absolutely melt a line of Corsair Pikemen, but provided you can sort of minimise the risk of range fire onto the Corsair Pikemen, and you can do that in other ways with UMBAR, they can form a very cheap and very effective front line against quite a lot of things. If you can sort of saturate your line with a lot of pikes, it's going to be quite difficult for enemies to try and wear you down from the front. The opposite philosophy to this is doing a lot of damage very quickly on the attack, and that is where the Corsair Savages come into play, an even cheaper unit actually at 400, but obviously their stats are very heavily weighted towards their attack. Attack of 10 and a charge bonus of 8 is obviously pretty good, and as two-handed axemen they also have that effectiveness against armour. They can also frighten nearby enemy infantry, and I think they might be the cheapest unit in the game that has that fear effect. So that's something they definitely have going for them, but obviously you don't need to look too long at them to realise that actually, in terms of taking arrow fire, they are the joint worst in the game, because they have no armour and no shields. I'm sure there's a couple of other units we've already gone through that have very similar stats, like the Snaga, but it just goes to show that the Corsair Savages are going to do terribly under archer fire. But there are a lot of them. There are 203, so they are essentially like a militia axe unit almost, but I'm not sure if I'd put them quite in that bracket, because they do have quite a lot of usefulness, very similar to the Orc Axemen, and of course this is where these lower tier units are where we still have quite a lot in common with the Orcs before we move on to a little bit more in common with Gondor and the like. And here is sort of the first line infantry unit that we have as UMBAR, the cheapest of them. And in fact, if you wanted a sort of unit that you can mass up as a line infantry unit, you have to actually spend quite a lot more if you want a unit that is sort of higher quality than the Corsair infantry. Now, having a look at some of these stats, an attack of 5 is actually equal to or greater than even some of the units of from the Kingdoms of Men. that are much more focused around their defence, but obviously the trade-in for this is that their defence does suffer as a result, mainly in their armour score, which is only 2, but they do have a shield value of 7, which is not bad at all. And UMBAR in general, as we will learn as we go into some of their higher tier units and their skirmishers, are very, very resilient and are almost a faction-wide tar pit other than the Corsairs we have already been through. Their defensive skill is obviously fairly low, but you can mitigate that lower armour score somewhat by upgrading the armour over here. Now, unlike Gondor, the vast majority of UMBAR's units cannot be upgraded to silver shields, only to bronze shields, so that is maybe a little bit of a downside to them, but overall still pretty good. And obviously only an armour score of 3, but again it does have the effect of ratcheting up the armour score by 2, so you could say that the armour value is 4, which is still low of course, but again these units are not really designed for getting tons of kills, they are designed for overwhelming the enemy. 203 of course. Very few units in the game can boast a higher unit count than that. Only Harad and some of the orcs, particularly Angmar, can outmatch that. However, from here onwards, the infantry will have a significantly more Gondorian feel to it, starting off with the Gaia footmen, and they are of course the standard spears of UMBAR, which you'll see quite a lot, either guarding the flanks in a pitched battle or guarding the front gates in a siege. Now, they are not AP like some of their allies from Harad, the Southern Warband of course. They of course can make shield wall, have all the trimmings of spearmen, and they start to get a little bit more in terms of total defense, mainly with regards to their shield value. Their armor is still not really in the same league as the Gondorians, but once again, you can upgrade the armor, which does have the effect of essentially buffing it to 5, which again, pretty good tar pit unit, not as good as the Gondorian spearmen, but they only cost 550. So yeah, you'll see quite a lot of the Gaia footmen because they do make a very solid, dependable unit for spears. However, if you want to do a little bit more damage, in particular armor piercing damage, you have the Gaia Halberts. Now, you know, I mentioned that UMBAR have got 3 polearms available to them. This is the one and only halberdier that they have, but this added AP damage can be a real bonus, and it is something, of course, which Gondor, again, I'm going to be comparing them to Gondor quite a lot because it is the faction that, along with Dol Amroth, of course, the sort of triumvirate of these factions that we have down in the southeast of Middle-earth, they do have quite a lot in common with them. And for Gondor, the Fountain Guard are the first polearm that is armor piercing that they can bring, and that is a very expensive unit, whereas the Gaia Halberd significantly less so. They're cheaper even than the Ethelond Halberdiers from Dol Amroth, and of course you can upgrade the armor of them as well, so you get the same unit model here as you would for the footmen. Now, in terms of stats, obviously it's a little bit difficult to sort of gauge these polearm units because their stats are all kind of low, but the Phalanx ability does sort of offset this quite a lot. Obviously good against armour, effective against cavalry. Honestly, their cheapness is what draws you to them, and of course saving money on units like this can let you get some of UMBAR's higher tier units, and UMBAR have got plenty of higher tier units to choose from. Now, it is worth saying as well, they do have a sort of more middling unit, of course, with the Mercenary Guildsmen, which a lot of factions have, that they can use as line infantry. One of UMBAR's traits is they do have pretty good morale across the board, other than with their lower tier Corsairs, so potentially getting a unit with lower morale can potentially give you, well, inflict some gaps on your line. But of course, if you wanted a sort of more middling quality unit in between the Corsair Infantry and the Castamere's Legion, which we will talk about in just a moment, then you might want to punt for a couple of these. They're not overly expensive, and they do have higher armour values, notably, than the Corsair Infantry in front of them, even with no upgrades. Now, however, we shall start to move on to some of UMBAR's quality infantry units, rather than sort of the more middling units, starting off with the Abrazanim Nadu Tariq, which in terms of a unit bear quite a lot in common with the Loka Flag Rim from Rune to the north. You can see some anchors on these shields, referencing UMBAR's more naval heritage, and of course they are essentially macemen, so they will do armour piercing damage in melee. Their attack values are actually quite high at 8. A lot of these macemen, like the Nmenrean Footmen and the Loka Flag Rim, will have lower attack values, but the Nadu Tariq, this means against non-armoured units they will still be able to do decent amounts of damage. They can also have their armour upgraded, as you can see here. The tabards are replaced with the more sort of solid plate armour. Now, it is worth saying as well that you cannot mass them up to the same extent that you can do with the Nmenrean Footmen or the Loka Flag Rim, so you cannot blanket your line with this amount of AP damage. They are going to be a little bit more fewer and far between. I believe you can only have 2 before the cost increases, in fact, but a total defense of 20 when you upgrade their armor values, technically 21 of course. They are very, very solid. Now, there is a reason of course that you can only bring 2 because they are quite effective, but also they do have kind of low skill, and you know, this does mean that of course against non-armored targets they still won't be ideal, even if they aren't quite dragging their heels to the same capacity as in particular the Nmenrean Footmen are. However, the Abrazanim also have a solution for this, and that is the Narduzagar. Now this is of course a two-handed swordsman unit, a swordmaster unit in the same vein as the Swordmasters of Carnan from Dale, or the Kerandros Swordmasters from Gondor. They are of course a skill-based swordsman, and you can see here a total defense of 20 with a defensive skill of 14. Very, very effective. All of these swordsman units can essentially be viewed as sort of equivalents to one another, although the Narduzagar, in particular when you look at them next to the Swordmasters of Carnan, the ability to upgrade their armour can be a pretty significant upgrade indeed. If you're facing off against the elves, the Narduzagar can potentially be a very good last line that you send in when all of the archers have expended all their ammunition, because of course the lack of a shield does leave them slightly vulnerable in this regard, but in terms of their melee stats they're pretty impressive indeed. Attack of 13 as well. And the Abrazanim in general also, well, not this one, but the Narduzagar has the ability to inspire nearby troops, which is a big deal. You know, it can really help tie UMBAR's line together. One of my favourite units for UMBAR, however, is here, the Castamere's Legion. In terms of a style, they are my favourite UMBAR unit, and that's, I don't say that lightly. UMBAR have got a lot of very nice looking units, but as a line infantry unit as well, they are one of the finest options in the game. You do pay for this. 875 for a line infantry unit is a lot. It means you're going to have to spend basically a huge bulk of your money on your front line, which potentially is not what you want to do in certain situations, but particularly against factions like Angmar and the like, who often get by on the pure strength of their infantry line. If you send the Castamere's Legion in, they will make sure that Angmar don't have it all their own way. That is a very specific example, of course, but they are one of the best quality frontline troopers in the game. Another good example of this would be the Earls of Esgaroth, but the Castamere's Legion in general have got higher stats across the board, I believe. The attack of 11 is obviously quite high for a sword and board unit. The shield value of 6 is actually lower than several units we've already seen, but they do have a high armour score, and their skill is also very good, so they will actually be able to go toe-to-toe with elven units as well, which is obviously a big boon should you be facing them. A unit that they share with Mordor is the Nmenrean Shield Guard, and of course this is a very similar unit actually to the Castamere's Legion, just a spear unit. They sort of rely on their quality more so than their quantity, of course. Both the Castamere's Legion and the Nmenrean Shield Guard, and all of the Abrazanim actually, have got much lower quantity, so you do need to sort of balance between your more numerous lower tiers and your more scarce higher tiers. But of course, as shield spearmen, I should say, these Nmenrean Shield Guard are fantastic. They can make shield wall, bonus fighting cavalry, good armour values, good defensive skill, honestly, for a spear unit as well. They are fairly expensive for spears, but there are situations in which you do want to blanket your line with a bit more anti-cav potentially, or in a siege where you want a bit more mass. Now, moving on to some of the more specialty units here in the middle, we can see we have the Corsair Fences, and I suppose you would count these as assassins. I mean, any unit that can hide and is dual wielding you count as assassins. They also have that effectiveness against armour that the Thieves of Tharbad have. However, unlike most assassins in the game, they do not have a ranged attack. But however, they are very, very deadly in melee, particularly against armoured units. They aren't really brought as much because they can, of course, be focused down by archers. They may have 2 HP, which is very significant actually for an assassin unit, but their very low armour score is going to leave them in a bit of bother against archers, rangers especially. But if you can get them into a nice blob fight against armoured units, they're going to do very well with their dual rapiers. But they are a rarer unit just because of the fact that assassins in general do tend to be quite risky. Now we move on to another very fine looking unit, the Naru Naaru Sentinels, which is one of the more recent additions to the game. They are of course a pike unit. They actually have something in common with the Hranadine Pikemen from Rudauer, because they are one of 2 pikes in the game to have a significant shield value. It's only 6, but most pikemen have to make do with none at all, so this means they can actually stand up to arrows pretty well when you combine this with that armour value of 11. They only have 1 HP, mind you, so they can't really hold a candle to the Caras Caladhon's Guardians from Lothlorien, which we haven't yet got to, of course, but they can throw their hat into the ring for the second place spot for pikes, in my opinion, just on the surface of things, when you put them up against the 1st Legion pikemen from Khazad-dûm and the Imladris sentries from Imladris. Be interesting to see what they can do. Of course, they can inspire. Combat bonus in deserts is something I haven't actually seen all that much anymore, which is a nice, interesting trait. Very good stats for pikes. I mean, pikes you expect to have lower stats, but obviously they're going to be very good. Not very many of them, however, so you have to remember that, you know, they will suffer from attrition a little bit more than other pikes, even if they can handle the pressure a little bit more. And then finally, the one unit that is essentially a general's bodyguard unit, or intended to be so, are the Harbingers of Castamere, or Harbingers as they're still known. They are, of course, you know, lower unit count here. They've been added these horns to make them look a little bit more like demons, more reminiscent of the Nazgul. They can chant, they frighten nearby enemy infantry, but of course they are dual-wielding multiple HP units, so they have a high defensive skill, total defense of 29, which is still not as high as several of the Elven units we've seen, but of course, you know, the chances are you're going to have more units to help the Harbingers of Castamere than the Elves are going to have. Still one of the units from the Kingdoms of Men which is going to be able to survive in a pure melee fight for the longest. Attack of 18 and a charge bonus of 10 as well. That's shock infantry-like stats coming from there. No AP, of course, but still a very, very strong unit. You're going to see them in a siege more often than not, however, because their ability to get a lot of kills in a blob fight is pretty impressive. So yeah, that was a fairly elongated section there with all of this infantry, but we will now move on to the archers and cavalry, and if you think that's going to be a sparser affair, you'd actually be wrong. So as you can see, I'm including the artillery in here because of course their infantry took up the whole roster, so I couldn't do it there, and actually we nearly took up the whole roster here as well, but it is worth saying that a lot of this comes down to the armour upgrades, which UMBAR can fit a lot of their units with bronze shields, some units that I actually didn't even know of. But to start off with, we will look at the artillery only briefly because they have a standard catapult and a standard ballista, which of course more likely to make an appearance in sieges. They don't do anything too special. But potentially you could bring them on an open field as UMBAR. You can certainly defend them, you have the numbers to do so, and making the enemy come towards you as UMBAR is something which quite often people will try and do. It's not something you have to do by any means, but it is still a possibility. Now, however, you can see that archers and cavalry, unlike with Angmar, which took up the whole roster of their infantry on the first go, and then were very sparse in this section, UMBAR have a lot of men. So again, like Gondor, they have quite a comprehensive roster. Starting off with the Corsair archers, which are the basic archer that they can bring. And again, like most low tier archers, this is an archer which bears quite a lot in common with the orcs, the Corsairs in general do. So they are focused very much around their quantity of arrows they're able to get down range. Like most lower tier orc archers, they have a missile attack of 4, dreadful armour scores and no shield value, so really they rely on their numbers to try and wear down enemy skirmishers rather than being able to survive themselves. If you wanted that sort of archer, you will have to look elsewhere in UMBAR's roster, which they certainly do have. They can also upgrade their armour. Again, this makes them a little bit more resilient, and potentially if you have a little bit of money left over at the end and you went for a skirmish heavy approach in which you want to try and wear the enemy down, this might be something you want to do, but ultimately you're more likely to upgrade the armour of other units rather than the Corsair archers, because you don't really expect these guys to survive at the best of times anyway. However, these archers are certainly ones that you get with the full expectation that they are going to be using their defensive abilities more so than their offensive ones. The Gaia archers are very much akin to the Gondor archers in that they are based around surviving and outlasting their enemy in a skirmish fight. They have a slight shield value, which is, you know, something the Gondorians don't have. This is of course offset by the fact that Gondorians have much higher armour values. But other than that, they are quite similar units. They have a missile attack of 5 as well. The Gaia archers, you can upgrade the armour of course to make them a little bit more effective. But certainly UMBAR and Gondor, in particular with their skirmishers more so than anything else in my mind, bear a lot in common with one another, because they don't really focus on their damage, but they certainly do focus on their own survivability, other than of course with their lower tier archers. But here you can see the Gaia archers. 600 is not a small amount of money, I suppose, but for an archer which is as durable and as generally cost effective as the Gaia archers, that's very reasonable to my mind. However, if you wanted a little bit more individual quality, then the Abrazani Nadubawi are going to be right up your alley, because they actually function as pretty decent melee infantry when all is said and done, but also they have a bigger shield value, more armour. They still have a missile attack of 5, but essentially they are just tougher and stronger. They are more expensive, so for the most part you don't really want to spend too much money on the Abrazani Nadubawi for the most part, but you know, they do make a very good foil. If you go very skirmish heavy, you can't go far wrong with them, and of course you can upgrade their armour as well. And with the upgraded armour, I'm not actually sure which archer out of these guys and the Bardian Marksman would be the toughest to bring down over a long period of time. It would be interesting to find out, certainly, but they are very similar. So of course Dale is another faction you could get into this, but Dale have got a little bit more of a varied archer line in particular, rather than just pure survivability. Of course UMBAR do have a damage dealer, which we'll get onto in a moment. But close range, the crossbow Corsairs are of course quite different to a lot of other crossbows, like for example the Cardlin and Isengard crossbows, focused a little bit more around armour, being tough, difficult to wear down. But of course, as I've said in the past, if you can't kill an entire unit of crossbows, or at least most of them very quickly, you shouldn't really bother, because a crossbow volley is still going to be pretty damn effective, even if you get rid of around half the unit. However, the crossbow Corsairs have got very low armour values, no shield value at all, so they can actually be killed off very, very quickly. However, the solution to this is that they can hide anywhere, so essentially you don't have to reveal them until the time is right, and also they are very, very damaging with a missile attack of 10, effective against armour as well. They are very, very brutal at range actually. They are one of the ultimate glass cannons in the roster, and I really like the crossbow Corsairs because of course if you hide them they can make a very good defensive tool on the flanks to enemy cavalry trying to get in and around you. And in general they can just be a real irritant, in particular to cavalry based armies, but also to infantry flanking manoeuvres as well. And obviously in a siege, if you get them in the right position, they're going to dominate enemy attacks. However, here we have the genuine damage dealer in the archer roster for UMBAR, and that is of course the rangers they have. Castamere's rangers, they bear a lot in common with stuff like the Dunedain rangers or the Franadine rangers or Athelian rangers. Missile attack of 5, generally speaking their stats are not terrible, mainly down to their defensive skill. They cost 850, which is pretty standard fare for a ranger, but actually something that is worth remarking upon is they can upgrade their armour, and I think, if I'm right in saying this, this is completely unique with regards to rangers to the Castamere's rangers. It certainly fits in with UMBAR's philosophy. They can affix bronze shields to a lot of their units, other than their very elite units, which of course have already got ridiculous armour values. But this, you know, the armour score can make them just that little bit tougher, and it is potentially something which could be useful. Again, I still believe that you're probably going to be upgrading the armour of other units first, but even so, it's a unique thing about the Castamere's Rangers which is worth remarking upon. And of course, UMBAR, perhaps influenced by their savage neighbours, the Haradrim, have some decent javelins as well. The Corsair Blackguards, which are decent javelins, they've got 11 missile damage, which is in excess of quite a lot of the lower tier javelins, of course. They do cost quite a lot, but they also double as pretty effective dual-wielding infantry units. They have pretty decent defensive skill. They are more makeshift dual-wielding units, though. They haven't got the same sort of stats as assassins, so you definitely want to use them first and foremost as a javelin unit. But of course they can hide anywhere, which is a big bonus. Bonus fighting cavalry, effective against armour. Expensive, but of course if you use your ambush javelin units very well, then if you've played as Rudau or Harad for any length of time, you know what the Corsair Blackguards are all about. And then finally, the final archer, which is an archer unit which, again, you know, another unit which UMBAR have sort of got in common with a unit from Arnor, or the fallen Three Kingdoms of Arnor. This time, Cardlan's Hearthguard of Amon Sul have a brother here in the Naru Naaru Guard, which are of course heavily armoured multiple HP spearmen, which are archers as well. So again, very, very resilient, a good place to put your general, purely because enemy cavalry is maybe going to be a little bit more reluctant to try and snipe the general out when they've got obviously that effectiveness against cavalry and the multiple HP, which means a charge, unless it's absolutely perfect, is likely not going to kill off too many units. And of course very high stats, as a general's bodyguard unit tends to have. High armour, decent shield value, difficult to skirmish with, especially if they are in and amongst UMBAR's already very difficult to wear down skirmish line. Now, however, we shall move on to the cavalry, which is not too comprehensive, which is in sort of accordance with the Gondorian way of thinking. However, they do have a pure melee cavalry unit, which Gondor do not have. It is the Merc cavalry, however, so it's not too unique. Of course, it's shared with many other factions, and of course, like those other factions, you can upgrade the armour of it to make it just that little bit more durable. Not going to win any prizes in the melee cavalry world, but again, it's still going to be very, very useful, used in a defensive fashion, which UMBAR in an open field can do very well when they set up defensively. This is going to be a very good unit. Obviously difficult to get cost efficiency off of a unit of lancers that you might be using when a unit like this is on the prowl. Again, I've mentioned before that the mercenary crossbowmen are notoriously difficult to use, and again they do have a very high missile attack, but do bear in mind enemy archers will shred them. You know, they have an armour of 7, that's not going to be good enough, and they have a low range as well, to the point where composite archers are of course going to be able to mow them down before they get into range. Only 50 of them as well. Very, very micro intensive, potentially very damaging, potentially the sort of thing which can swing a cav fight in your favour provided horse archers are not present. But do use extreme caution when using the mercenary crossbowmen, because very often they won't work out for you. The damage one of the two damage dealers that UMBAR have, slightly more expensive unit, the Nmenrean Lancers, a unit they share with their masters in Mordor, of course. Effective against armour off the charge bonus of 15, very, very competent Lancer unit. Total defense of 27, they are very resilient with a shield value of 8 and an armour value of 10. Defensive skill is decent as well for a Lancer unit. An attack of 6, of course. You don't really want to keep them in melee for too long, however a Lancer unit is best used when it is constantly on the move, micro intensive, but one of the Lancer units which is a little bit more resilient to arrows, so at the very least your microing is going to sort of decide alone how this unit does, rather than the enemies just trying to skirmish them down from afar. And then of course the centre to any faction which is able to field a very good cav force is a knight unit, and the Warlords of UMBAR of course sharing their style with the Harbingers of Castamere. In terms of a knight unit, again they've got very high stats across the board, armour of 9, defensive skill of 15, shield value of 8, hit points of 2, means they're very, very difficult to bring down, especially if they're riding alongside the Merc Cavalry. It can prove to be a very difficult nut to crack for enemy cavalry forces. Even Khand they would ultimately win of course, but it would be difficult for them to carve their way through all that anti-cavalry, which of course they do have. Effective against armour, they inspire nearby troops and frighten the nearby enemy infantry, but of course, as knight units are, very expensive at 1500. Charge bonus of 20 though, the full 20. So, that is it. That is the full UMBAR roster. We got there in the end. Now we shall move back to the army selection screen and talk about what I think of them. So just before we get going here, let's take a cursory glance, in particular at some of those higher tier units of course, where you can see morale is locked. 15 as well, morale locked, so actually the Nmenrean Sentinels with that locked morale, they might just fight forever regardless of what's going on around them, whereas some of these units of course can be broken in the right situations. But with locked morale of course, with a lot of these higher tier units, UMBAR's elite core is going to be very difficult to get rid of. The Abrazanim are the sort of the most expensive unit that will break. Obviously in the lower sort of tier units you can see they have lower morale of course, but with inspiration and with a lot of these locked morale units, UMBAR are the sort of army you can't easily get rid of through routing like you can with the Orcs. And of course potentially UMBAR have got quite a lot of men in their armies with all these lower tier forces. But what do I think of them? Well, to anyone who's been paying attention of course you'll note that UMBAR is one of my favourite factions. In fact, I have said before that obviously I do quite like Rudauer, but that doesn't mean to say I'm very good with Rudauer. In fact, I've had very little success with Rudauer because they do sort of tend towards this sort of more risky style of play because of their sort of more fragile nature, whereas UMBAR I do have success with, and that leans me a little bit more towards saying that UMBAR is probably my favourite faction in the game. And the reason for this is they're so forgiving. You know, they are, with their very tough to break down skirmish line, enemies that are going to try and do their damage from afar to you, which is always really, really annoying when they manage to pull that off against you and they essentially win before battle is met. That's something which you're never really going to be able to do against UMBAR because their archers are so durable, very similar to Gondor in that regard. But unlike Gondor, their cav force is a little bit more well tooled for being defensive in nature, which is how I tend to use cavalry overall. And even if you wanted to be more aggressive, you have the Nmenrean Lancers. They are a very versatile faction in general, actually, UMBAR, and this of course comes from the Kingdoms of Men in general, a little bit more diverse, but you know, alongside Rune for the evil men, they are probably the ones which have the most options available to them, whereas Rune put a little bit more of an armour piercing slant on things. UMBAR go for a little bit more of survivability, and that to me is a little bit more forgiving, and I do quite like that. They have a lot of units that are very good to choose from. Of course you have a lot of numbers as well with their sort of links to the evil men, which Gondor do not have. Gondor do have a little bit more of a solid front line, I would say, because even though the Castamere's Legion are very, very good, they're also very expensive, and if you bring a full line of Castamere's Legion, the obvious price for that is you're going to have to sacrifice units elsewhere, whereas Gondor, with their Gondor infantry, they're probably going to be able to put up a much more well-rounded army than UMBAR. And this is where really the sort of choice comes into play. You have to choose between the quality and the quantity of certain units. For example, if you went for a full cav force of the Warlords of UMBAR, maybe a Nmenrean Lancer and then a couple of mercenary cavalry, that's a lot of money you've dumped in there, and then you're going to have to essentially choose between whether you want a very strong skirmish line or a very strong infantry line. But again, this is the sort of choice that you have to make with a lot of the more evil factions, Mordor in particular. So UMBAR have got links to all the factions that are around them, really. They've imported a lot of all these philosophies, and that's part of why I like them. They've got a lot of options, and generally speaking, enemies are not going to be able to just cheese you from a distance, which is, you know, one of the reasons why I love UMBAR so much, because I hate being cheesed from range. This is of course something which they share with some of their neighbours, but to my mind UMBAR, just, there's something about them, and of course they look terrific as well. To my mind they are also the finest looking faction in the game, but that is also a little bit more subjective. So yeah, that's my opinions on UMBAR. We are coming to the end, as I said. There's only 3 factions left. There is no Orcs, so we won't be able to go through the sort of the races as we have been now, so we will be jumping straight to the good Kingdoms of Men, And to prevent a little bit more of a similar sort of feel to the next one, we are going to be jumping to a very different sort of faction, and we will be doing Rohan next, so I'm sure a lot of people are going to be quite happy about that. But yes, I hope you found this somewhat informative, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.